Hey guys, my name is Joanna, also known as Just Another Flutist here on YouTube, and I have partnered up with the Flute Center of New York to bring you guys monthly flute review videos. If you use my code JAF, you will get yourself a couple of perks when you order flutes from the Flute Center of New York. Number one, free domestic shipping within the US. You can get this perk for your trials as well, but just know that you will be charged the shipping cost up front and then refunded the cost when the flutes are returned. Number two, you get an extended 10-day trial, usually it's only 7 days. Number three, you get an extended 18-month warranty on your new flute. And number four, you can take up to 3 instruments out on trial at a time. If you already know which flute you want to purchase, head on over to the Flute Center of New York's website. I will link it down below. And you can use my code JAF as the coupon code at checkout. If you want to take flutes out on trial, you will need to contact the Flute Center of New York directly by email or phone. I will leave the link to their contact page in the bottom bar as well. Just remember to also give them my code JAF so you can get all the perks. And just to be transparent, I do earn a commission on each flute that is purchased through the Flute Center of New York. A couple of notes regarding trying flutes. Take off all rings and any dangly jewelry that can potentially scratch the flute. Never use the polishing cloth, the swabbing cloth, or the cleaning rod that comes with each new flute because they are not yours yet. And lastly, a disclaimer, every flutist plays each flute differently. Like in Harry Potter, just as the wand chooses the wizard, so the flute chooses the flutist. Keep in mind that my mouth formation is not going to be exactly the same as yours, so air is actually not going to travel through my mouth into the flute in exactly the same way. However, I will describe to the best of my ability how these flutes appear to like to be played. And if you find that what I am describing matches how you play naturally, then these flutes might work really well for you. Alright, and with all that said and done, let's hop right into the review. Today we will be reviewing the Trevor James Privilege and Cantabile flutes. Both flutes come in a typical French cover with this white furry lining, and also in a typical French case. If you've never opened a French case before, all you do is you take your thumbs and you slide the buttons outward and then you open the case. Each case comes with a shoulder strap and a cleaning rod in the exterior pouch. And tucked between the cover and the case, you will find a zipped baggie that includes the following. A manual, which not only includes cleaning instructions, but also a fingering chart. I think it's really great that they include a fingering chart because it's really easy to get confused with all the very similar but not the same fingerings among different woodwind instruments. So this will be really useful for those of you who are hopping onto the flute from, say, the clarinet or the oboe. A guarantee, a swabbing gauze, and a microfiber polishing cloth. Alright, so first we are going to go over the Trevor James Privilege. Silver plated head joint with silver lip plate and riser, silver plated body and keys, French open hole, pointed key arms, B foot joint, split E mechanism. So the way that this flute likes to be played, I feel a sense of having to rush my air quite a bit, starting around the middle to the middle back of my mouth. On some flutes, you don't actually feel that feeling that air has to be rushing back there. On some flutes, you'll feel that feeling further up in your mouth. Some flutes, you'll feel it further back in your mouth. On the Trevor James Privilege, I personally feel it kind of in the middle to middle back. Now, the second part of blowing into this flute, while maintaining that rushing air feeling in the middle of your mouth, is a sense of having to shoot the air from different parts of your mouth. It's kind of like when you are throwing a ball. If you were to take the ball from here all the way back here and then you were to swing it up like that and over, then you would expect, right, that the ball would be thrown quite far away. But if you just keep your arm up here and then you just kind of throw like this, then the ball is not going to go very far. So now you have to imagine this throwing motion that I just described inside of your mouth while maintaining that feeling of rushing air. If you go back here and you throw further like this, the ball will travel further. So in the same way, the air will actually travel further and faster if you shoot it from further back in your mouth. Therefore, it's better for your high notes. Now, if you do throw the air from further forward in your mouth, it's the same thing as throwing a ball from here and then just kind of chucking it like this. It's not going to go very far. That means you won't be overly pushing your air. So that is really good for your lower notes. Now the thing about getting your lower notes to really ring though is that you have to scoop out the hollow behind your front bottom teeth. I do feel that I had to keep this portion of my mouth scooped out, hollowed out for all the registers on this flute, but it was more important for the lower notes. Now on other flutes, I have noticed that the more you have to scoop out this hollow, the more you actually have to aim your air straight into the hollow. So in that case, you can actually feel the air kind of rushing into the hollow. However, on this flute, I find that you don't actually feel the air rushing into the hollow. It's almost rushing just kind of over it, but that extra space just gives your whole sound a lot more resonance. So essentially on this flute, I find that if you really want your tone to ring, you just have to hollow out that portion behind your front bottom teeth, but you don't have to particularly feel that you have to do anything with it. Also, I messed around with the gizmo. And on this flute, it really just helps with your tuning. It doesn't really make it much easier to play because the high C is already very easy to play on this flute. All right, and now for harmonics. In terms of getting the harmonics out, it's the same idea as what I was talking about for higher notes and lower notes when we were just noodling around on this flute. These harmonics pretty much just pop out on their own. They're not particularly resistant. The highest harmonics though, which were the 6th and 7th harmonics on the low C that I could get out on this flute, did tend to be a little thin. However, they can be improved with some effort. So you really have to keep that part behind your bottom front teeth really hollowed out for it. And now for tone color. Tone color on this flute is all about playing with that hollow behind your bottom front teeth. Are you guys sensing a theme here? The more scooped out and hollow that part behind your bottom front teeth is, the more your tone will be rich and full and chocolatey. The less you scoop it out and keep it hollow, the thinner it's going to be. Now, a thin sound does not necessarily mean bad, because there are some pieces of music out there that actually require you to not use a super rich sound. So it's very important to be able to play with the extremes of tone color, and it is very possible on this flute. Now for the mechanism. I noticed that the Trevor James, in comparison to all the other flutes that I have tried, it is not the most light, but it is also not the most resistant. It's like just in the middle. It's kind of like the Goldilocks of flute mechanisms. Now, some people like extremely light mechanism and some people like more resistant mechanisms. So it all depends on what you prefer. But in terms of evenness, this baby is so even. I do notice that the trill keys, the B-flat lever, and the gizmo are placed slightly higher than on many other flutes. I like this because it makes it really easy for you to find the trill keys. And it also helps prevent you from accidentally hitting the trill keys, the gizmo, the lever, when you're not supposed to hit them. I'm thinking that people with bigger hands would really appreciate this, but I have small hands and I also appreciate this, so it really depends on your preference. All right, now for articulation. Compared to other flutes, I noticed that I need to flatten the tip of my tongue a little bit more. Whereas on other flutes, I often feel that I have to make the tip of my tongue very pointy. On this flute, I don't find I have to do that as much. My tongue hits the roof of my mouth a bit behind my top front teeth. So it's not just behind it where your teeth meet your gums. it's a little bit further back than that. I'm guessing it's because where my top front teeth meets the roof of my mouth, that area is right above the scooped out hollow portion behind my bottom front teeth. So if my tongue was all the way up here, the bottom of my tongue would actually kind of obstruct that area. So I find I have to move my tongue back a bit. Observe where your hollow is behind your bottom front teeth and move your tongue accordingly so that the bottom of your tongue does not obstruct it. Now for double tonguing, I find that the K part of my double tongue has to be 1, very light, and 2, quite far forward. I imagine it to be very close to where my T is. So I'm imagining myself going ta, ka, ta, ka. So it's not ta, ka, because I noticed that if I let myself use my K way far back, it raises the middle of my tongue so that it obstructs where that feeling of rushing air is supposed to be. So to pull off double tonguing effectively on this flute, I find that I have to keep my double tongue extremely light and almost lazy. You almost feel like you're barely grazing the roof of your mouth with your T's and your K's. And lastly, dynamics. For dynamics on this flute, I find that it has more to do with that feeling of rushing air. The wider and the more air you put into that feeling of rushing air in the middle of your mouth, the louder you're going to play. The narrower you make that feeling of rushing air and the less air you put into it, the softer you're going to play. So you play with tone color with the scooped out portion behind your bottom front teeth, and then you can play with dynamics separately with that feeling of rushing air inside of your mouth. This gives you a crazy amount of flexibility to play with tone color and dynamics separately. A lot of times I find that on some flutes it's hard to get a rich tone while being very soft. And conversely, I also find that it is harder to play with a hollow, thinner sound while playing very loud. However, I do find that on the Trevor James Privilege, it's actually quite easy to do both of those things. Alright, now let's look at the Trevor James Cantabile. Sterling silver head joint, silver plated body and mechanism, French open hole model, pointed key arms, .016 tubing, so standard wall tubing, split E mechanism, B foot joint. Basically, the big difference between the Cantabile and the Privilege is that the Cantabile has a full sterling silver head joint, whereas on the Privilege, the only sterling silver parts were the riser and lip plate. That means, of course, that the Cantabile has a lot more silver going on than the Privilege. Typically, the more silver that you have in your flute than nickel, because silver plated means that it's silver plated over nickel, the richer your tone will be, and I also noticed that it's easier to control your tone. Let's see how it plays out on this flute. Very similar two-part blowing technique as on the Privilege, so you've got that feeling of rushing air in the middle to middle back of your mouth, and you have to scoop out that portion behind your bottom front teeth. However, the Cantabile can take a lot more air without being overblown, which means that you basically have a lot more to work with in all registers. It's like if you're a painter. On the Privilege, you feel like you have a good collection of paintbrushes to work with, but on the Cantabile, you have a much larger collection of brushes to work with. So that means that you could do a lot more effects simply because you have more equipment to work with. On the Cantabile, that feeling of rushing air is quite a bit wider than on the Privilege. The higher register feels very similar, but you just have a lot more air that you're working with. On the lower registers, you feel like your air is being shot into two different locations. So that ball that you're throwing from up front here is splitting into two. The first location is to your top lip. So you can really feel the air rushing right under your top lip and coming out. The second location is actually to the hollow behind your bottom front teeth. Whereas on the privilege, you just kind of left that hollow alone and you just kind of played over top of it. On the lower registers in the Cantabile, that is actually the second location where you really feel the air shooting towards. So basically, the higher you go, the more you'll feel that rushing directed air against your top lip. Though you still have to keep that portion behind your bottom front teeth hollowed out. But the lower you go, the more you'll feel like you're splitting that air in two, and the hollow part behind your bottom front teeth also gets some of that directed air. I also played with the gizmo on the Cantabile. Same thing as on the privilege. It doesn't really help with ease of playing as much as it helps with tuning. And now for harmonics. Exactly the same idea as on the privilege, you just have more to work with. And because you have a lot more to work with, I noticed that the higher harmonics are naturally more filled out. You don't have to actually work as hard to fill them out yourself. However, I did notice that the highest harmonic that I tried to get out, which was the 7th harmonic on the low C, was extremely resistant. So you got the privilege where they're not as resistant in the highest harmonics, but then you got the Cantabile where they're more naturally filled out in the highest harmonics, but the highest one is way more resistant. It's a give and take, basically. And now for tone color. Same idea as on the privilege. The more scooped out that portion is behind your bottom front teeth, the richer your tone will be. The less it's scooped out behind your bottom front teeth, the thinner and more hollow your tone is going to be. However, again, you have way more to work with. So you really feel like not only do you have a larger collection of paintbrushes to work with, you actually have a larger palette of colors to work with. Basically, you can play with the extremes of tone color way more than on the privilege. And now for the mechanism. I think the body is pretty much exactly the same as the privilege. It's that Goldilocks, not too light and not too resistant mechanism. And the trill keys, B-flat lever and gizmo, are placed in exactly the same way. Easy to find when you want to use them, hard to hit when you don't want to use them. All right, and now for articulation. The tongue placement is exactly the same as on the privilege. However, I feel like your tongue has to be a hair lighter than on the privilege, or else every percussive thing you do with your tongue is magnified that much more. I believe it is simply because you are working with way more air. Double tonguing, also exactly the same, also needs to be way lighter. I've noticed that on other flutes, if you switch between models, typically even your articulation pretty much completely changes. But Trevor James has successfully made it so that these two flutes play differently, but the placement of the tongue is actually pretty much the same. And now for dynamics. You probably can guess what I'm about to say here, but it feels the same as the privilege, except that you have way more range. Because again, you got way more to work with. So basically, you can widen that column of rushing air even more, and you can narrow it down even more. So that means that you can go way louder and way softer, than on the Privilege. Not to say that it's absolutely impossible on the Privilege, but it takes way more control on the player's part on the Privilege to pull off the same thing that you can do much more naturally and easily on the Cantabile. Alright, and that is my review of these two beautiful Trevor James flutes. Before I forget, we have to tell you guys how much it costs. So the Trevor James Privilege with this specific setup that I have going on here costs $1,075. The Trevor James Cantabile in the specific setup in this review costs $1,575. Take a look at what you are using the flute for, take a look at your budget, and take a look at how you respond to each of these flutes before you decide which flute works the best for you. And that is it for this review. I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it helpful. If you guys have suggestions for future reviews with the Flute Center of New York, please leave it in the comments below. Not only do I read them, but the Flute Center of New York reads them as well. And if you have a Trevor James flute, especially the ones that I reviewed in this video, please comment below and let us know what you think of them as well. Don't forget to follow the Flute Center of New York on their social media. I will link them in the bottom bar below. And as usual, if you like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday. My last video is over there, and if you want to catch me during the week, my social media networks are down there. But otherwise, I'll see you guys next week. Bye. I like shooting with this mic because I have a lot more room to work with, but that means that it sometimes picks up on people driving by.